My name is Patrick Kingsley, and I'm an international correspondent for the New York Times. I cover quite a lot of things for the Times, but in particular, I focus on migration, and that builds on work I did when I was at The Guardian, where I was The Guardian's migration correspondent. And I used the work that I did at The Guardian as the basis for a book about the European migration crisis called The New Odyssey. I was the Egypt correspondent for The Guardian between 2013 and 2015. And towards the end of that time, well, in 2014, the political story in Egypt was sort of dying down, but something else was happening, which was that lots of Syrian refugees who had fled to Egypt in the aftermath of the 2011 uprising in Syria were then trying to make the onwards journey across the Mediterranean to Europe. And I became quite interested in how they were doing that, why they were doing that, why they were deciding to make that secondary movement. And in the process, I got fascinated by the smuggling networks that were moving them towards Europe. And from there, it just was a kind of hop, skip, and a jump to wanting to cover this full time. And so in 2015, I started a secondment focusing on migration. And that led to a full-time job traveling around 25 countries in Europe, in the Middle East, and North Africa, trying to work out why people want to move in the first place and how they move and what they do once they get to the other end. Well, the first thing I'd say is that a great reporter doesn't necessarily work for the New York Times or even a major international news outlet or even an English language one. A great reporter can be in a country like Azerbaijan or Georgia, outside of the spotlight, but working very hard and very diligently under, frankly, probably much tougher circumstances than I have to work under with the backing of a big international news organization. So that's my preamble. But I think the qualities that make a great reporter, firstly, a kind of sense of outrage or a sense of passion about a particular topic, or a sense of outrage about an injustice. You have to have something that really drives you to want to spend long hours, long nights, weekends pursuing a particular topic and try and get to the bottom of a particular mystery. Like this isn't a job that you can do 8 hours a day, 5 days a week. It spills over into everything. And so you have to treat it as a vocation. And in order to treat it as a vocation, you have to really care. So you have to have that sense of horror about something bad going wrong, or just sense of interest in the complexity of a situation, or a sense of empathy, a deep sense of empathy in other people. And I think you also have to have obviously a commitment to truth and accuracy, and you can't let that that passion and that desire to expose wrongdoing tilt you into activism. You have to be trusted to both to care about something, but to be accurate about it and not to allow yourself to play fast and loose with the facts just because you feel outraged by something. So I feel like a great reporter has both a great diligence and a great sense of vocation, and balances those two things to create accurate but also powerful work. And regarding how that affects migration reporting, I mean, I don't really feel that migration reporting has to be, we have to construe it as something particularly different to other forms of reporting. It has a particular focus on why people move and how they move, but it should involve the same skills and the same level of commitment that we bring to other subjects. Migration is such a controversial subject because by almost its very nature, it tears at the assumptions and the logics of the societies in which we live in. We live in these days nation states with borders and with different legislations according to the different countries that you're in. Often to move between those different jurisdictions, you have to have a visa, a passport, and certainly irregular migration, which is what I've focused on in my career, tears at the logic of that system. And it makes people question the ground on which they're standing, because ordinary folk don't necessarily move around that much, and to then be confronted by other people who are moving around into their homelands, I think is quite disorientating. But I think the challenge of a migration correspondent is to remind people that, as much as it seems counter-logical to the way that some people live their lives, actually migration is very normal, and the world is very interconnected and has been for centuries and millennia. I think the complexity of covering migration is to acknowledge that migration seems disorientating for some readers, but also to try and encourage readers to remember the fact that migration is also very normal and a positive and a benefit and a fact of life. It's difficult because the two are not always the same. The easy answer is to say, well, we have a responsibility to the truth and the truth alone, and everything else falls by the wayside. But in reality, reporting is much more complex than that. And you have a responsibility to the person that you interview, a vulnerable refugee, for example, and you want, in the process of reporting their story, not to put them in danger, not to put their family in danger. And maybe the way to do that is to maybe not include their surname or something like that. But in the process of doing that, then you're reneging on your responsibility to your readers, who need to know that what you're reporting is factual and believable. And we can show our readers that something is factual by naming a source or giving them more details about someone's life, in order that the readers know this is a real person and that we haven't just made them up. So there's a tension there between the different responsibilities one has, and it's not always resolvable. It's even more complex than just saying we have a responsibility to the readers, we have a responsibility to the editors, and we have a responsibility to sources. Because first of all, like, what reader? Is it I work for an American newspaper, but I'm British, and half my readers are from neither of those countries. So who are we writing for, and when we write for different groups of people, what kinds of assumptions are those different groups bringing, and what kinds of knowledge bases are they bringing to the article, and how do we cater for those different knowledge bases, and how do we wrestle between what my priorities are as a reporter and what maybe my editor's priorities are. And these are not simple things, and I don't actually have a very clear answer about that, but I think that's okay. I think reporting and journalism is constantly a wrestling match between all these competing priorities, and as long as one has in one's head the general aim of being accurate and therefore doing right by your readers, making it a complex subject understandable, and therefore, again, living up to the responsibility one has to one's readers, but also telling a story in such a way that doesn't place the people that you're writing about in more danger than they previously were. I think as long as you have those broad aims in your mind, even though there are complexities there and contradictions, you will end up in roughly the right place, but it's not necessarily an easy process. I'm not sure my experiences or learnings are that replicable, but for what it's worth, I feel some of the things I've learned are, number one, it's important to think about migration reporting not just about the journey, but also the context about why someone began that journey, why they didn't stop that journey at a certain point on its trajectory and pushed on to another place, and what happened once they arrived. Because in a way, the actual act of migration, the act of journeying, is only a very short period in the whole experience of migration as a whole. And certainly, I think, if I was to criticize my own work, it's that I am maybe too interested and too fascinated by the physical act of moving, and not concerned enough about the act of arriving and settling and integrating. My job title at The Guardian was migration correspondent. It wasn't immigration correspondent or integration correspondent, and maybe it should have been, because that's the hardest bit. The hardest bit is, as we were alluding to earlier, is how do you marry the needs and expectations and traumas of a migrant with the anxieties and needs of a host population. And I feel like the best work that someone focused on migration, at least in Europe right now, can be doing is not necessarily advocating for people to be rescued at sea or not necessarily like focusing on the rights and wrongs of how they're treated as they move, but what happens once they arrive, and the mechanisms of relocation and integration and job prospects and language learning. And I feel probably the thing that I haven't been focused enough on, and I'm still not focused enough on, is that active arrival and living, because that's ultimately what defines the success of someone who moves to a new country. It's not how they got there, it's what happens after they got there.
You talk about the journey and the arrival, and the fact that obviously migration correspondents in recent times have tended to be very focused on that journey part. The integration component at arrival, obviously, you're highlighting as a key factor that needs to be thought about more. But I think one of the things that I would raise as well, which is particularly relevant for a lot of the communities in the countries that we're dealing with here, a lot of these former Soviet and Eastern Access Partnership countries, is also the implications of the departure. And actually what it means for a country, for there to be a huge kind of like emigration and sort of even the diaspora kind of component of that. So I'm not sure. I think obviously you raised this. I mean, thinking about it obviously from the point of view of things like climate change and conflict is critical. I think a lot of places are facing significant issues simply because of the economic disparities between nations and the opportunities that afford themselves in other places. So yeah, I wonder whether or not there's anything that you have mused upon on that side of things as well.
Well, if I was to extrapolate a bit from my own particular experiences, maybe and to build on what you were saying, maybe one might just summarize that whether you are focusing on migration from Azerbaijan or Georgia, or whether, like me, you're focusing on migration from the Middle East or North Africa to Europe, I guess the important thing perhaps isn't to get too fixated on the actual active movement, but to look at all the things surrounding that movement at either end, at origin and at destination. So in my case, I feel like I should have been and should still be more interested in what happens to people once they arrive. Maybe for people reporting in the Caucasus, it's interesting to think about what are the effects of outward migration on the place that those migrants have left behind. What happens when a huge population of people leaves their home country? What does that do to the political structures there? What does it do to the economic structures? What does it mean for a country when they are very reliant on remittances from overseas? What does it mean when a whole cohort of bright young people are not filling the civil service or the judiciary? And what does it mean for scrutiny and public discourse in that country of origin? And yeah, maybe the lesson here that I've learned is to think about all the issues surrounding the literal act of migration, rather than just focus on that quite small synapse between origin and departure, or movement between origin and departure, and to think about all the surrounding issues that have that are affected by that movement.
The other challenge, I mean, so you've very properly used the term irregular migration as a kind of key facet of what you cover, and I think this question of terminology, how you describe things, can be a serious challenge in migration reporting, because there's often a barrier between what people perceive to be kind of like telling it like it is and reinforcing things, reinforcing the perceptions of stuff. So I'm wondering whether or not you have a set of rules and guidelines within the New York Times, or that you've used previously from The Guardian or whatever, that you adhere to in terms of the use of language, or whether or not things are more instinctive, or whether or not you have a different way of working out how you're going to talk about stuff.
Well, I do have a set of ways of thinking about language, and I'll just cite a few words to show you how I think about certain things. So the first is the concept of irregular migration. Now, some people, instead of saying irregular migration, might say illegal migration. But that is casting an aspersion on the migrant who's doing that migration, and it could actually be inaccurate, because if someone's moving and they would qualify for asylum, then what they've done by moving is not illegal. So I feel irregular migration is a more accurate and also a more humane descriptor, because you are not casting a judgment on the rights and wrongs of why that person's moving. Then the question of, like, what do you call someone who's on the move, is quite a vexed issue, certainly in the kind of reporting on migration that I'm particularly interested in. When I really started focusing on migration in 2015, I thought migrant was quite a good descriptor for just to describe it, as a catch-all descriptor for someone who's on the move. But then it quite quickly became a quite pejorative word. And in response to that, a lot of people, or some people, including The Guardian and Al Jazeera, they felt that you should call a migrant a refugee. But then that was problematic because, yes, it was a more sympathetic way of describing somebody's on the move, but it also wasn't necessarily accurate because technically, on some certain definitions, a refugee is only someone that has been able to successfully claim asylum. So then people came up with this kind of dual terminology. They would say refugees and migrants. They would say 1,000 refugees and migrants arrived in this camp in Greece, or something like that. And for me, that was also problematic because even though it was like both trying to be humane and accurate, it was also implicitly creating a value judgment on what it was to be a migrant, because it was acknowledging that you don't know exactly how person X, who you've never met before, you don't know why they've decided to move, and it's wrong to either to besmirch them with a pejorative or to create them into an angel by calling them a refugee. But in the process of calling that person a refugee or a migrant, that kind of dual description, you're also implying that refugee is good and migrant is bad, and you're kind of falling into this trap that you're trying to avoid in the first place. And so that leads me back to just feeling like, well, I'm going to describe people according to what they're doing, rather than trying to get into this messy game of trying to describe why they are moving, because we don't necessarily know why they're moving. So that leads me back to the word migrant, because it's a description of someone's action at the point at which I am describing them, rather than trying to project motive onto them, which I might get wrong. And fine, if some people have used migrant in a pejorative way at some point, that's unfortunate, but it avoids me getting into a tangle about it avoids me being inaccurate, to be honest. And then another word I think is interesting, or another collection of words that are interesting that I now try to avoid, are words like flow, wave, flood. These are all words that I use a lot of, particularly in my book about the refugee crisis. A flood of refugees, a wave of refugees, a flow of migrants. And I remember in one review they picked me up for this because they said it's sort of dehumanizing, and it is dehumanizing. And I think just as important, it's also inaccurate, because the process of irregular migration is often like very much not a flow. I think the thing that defines irregular migration is stasis, punctuated by very brief moments of flow, of movement. So it's rather than being like a tsunami, it's more like a canal with lots of locks on it, and the water can move if the locks open, but the locks don't always open. And so the idea of a flow or a flood is actually inaccurate, because people spend most of the time when they are migrating irregularly in camps waiting. And then the other problem with those kinds of words is they create the impression of like an irresolvable problem. If something is a flood or a tsunami or a flow, if something is described as a flood or a flow, it sounds like it's unmanageable. Whereas, one of the points that I tried to make, one of the analytic points I've tried to make in my coverage, is that the kinds of numbers that are moving don't have to be impossible to manage. And to help convey that analytic point, I think it's useful not to use such emotional language as flood or flow. So these are just some of the words that I've thought about, and I've either tried to excise from my reporting lexicon, or the converse, use them more.
And I do think that this thing about reporting instinct is really, really important. And you can tell people how to do things, but you have to naturally feel the right.
I think it's also okay to acknowledge that like instinct is not necessarily something you have immediately. You also learn stuff, and you pick up your instincts become better as you become more experienced, as you become more used to thinking about these things. I didn't think in a particularly sharp way about some of these words that I was just talking about when I started doing this kind of reporting. But it's only as time goes on that you reflect more, and through that reflection, your instincts become sharper. So it's okay if like you don't have the answers to everything at the start. I mean, that is almost by definition the process of reporting. You are finding stuff out and you're becoming wiser and more knowledgeable as that process goes on. Default way in which you as a reporter tend to report or produce your reporting, i.e. in a written article or a podcast or a broadcast piece that lasts 3 minutes, that default way may not be the best, most exciting, most revealing way of telling that story. And a good example of this for me was when we were trying to tell a story about why people moved from Syria in the first place. And, you know, one way of doing that was just have a long article, lots of text, and then you move from case study to case study. But that's a little bit prosaic and maybe a little bit boring, and it doesn't draw the reader in as much as what we ultimately decided to do, which was to have 6 photographs of each person's bag that they were going to take on this boat journey across the Mediterranean. And by showing the contents of their bag and seeing, this little keepsake that this person had decided to bring from their home, or this Quran, or this house key that was the key that unlocked their house that no longer existed anymore because it was bombed. These little objects carefully arranged on a carpet next to their bag, they told visually a much more powerful story than me just writing a 1,200 word text about it. Now, obviously, there was text underneath his pictures to explain each object, but this kind of told the story in a slightly more original and interesting way. And I think it's just a useful reminder of how we have all these new wizardries at our disposal, be they, involving a podcast or a little audio clip that you can put into an article, or a little graphic that you can toggle that will show you the different routes that someone might be able to take at a certain point in time. And those can be just a more interesting way of telling a story. And as hard as it is to kind of take a step back from your reporting, which is exhausting and like intellectually difficult as it is, like it is worth just sometimes, if you can, and you have the editors or you have the resources, the technology to think about things in a different way, to do that rethinking of storytelling. That said, it's easier said than done, and sometimes you don't have the time, the resources, the editor to really invest in a sort of different style of storytelling. And even at the New York Times, where we have graphics editors and we have visual editors and we have people who are thinking all the time about not telling a story in 1,000 words, even we sometimes just don't have the time or the resources to tell every story in a new way. So I would encourage people to think big, but also not to beat themselves up if at their outlet they don't actually have the time or the facilities to do this. Well, I've got 2 ideas that have just popped into my head in response, neither of which may be that useful. But the first is just to cite a story that I did from Moldova it was essentially about what happens to a country when so many people emigrate. Like, what does that do to the social fabric in that country? And like we could have sort of done just a big bird's eye view story about the fact that X number of people have left, and that has affected the health service or the I don't know, the judiciary, because there aren't enough judges or there aren't enough doctors, and so on and so on. But I tried to think, like, what is a more captivating way? What is an exciting human interest way of telling that story that maybe that doesn't foreground the kind of macro numbers, but nevertheless through like a small story can tell a bigger one. And my idea was to try and find just a near deserted village where there was no one left, but maybe, you know, one or two people left. And I'd also heard of some villages where there were grandparents and then there were children, but there was no one in between. It was all the parents had left. And eventually we found this village that just had one person left living in it, mostly because everyone had emigrated, but in the more recent history, because the remaining two people of the population of 3 had been murdered by a farm laborer from a nearby farm. And so it was this very dramatic story that, you know, it couldn't be like the explanation for why every village in Moldova was emptying out, because, you know, how many populations of 3 are suddenly reduced to 1 because 2 of them get murdered in their home? Answer, probably 1, and that was that village. So, you know, in one sense, it wasn't such a representative story, but the kind of drama of it and the exceptionalism of it allowed us to tell a slightly less kind of gripping story that was not very exceptional, which is that every village in Moldova is emptying out because people are either going to the capital or they're going elsewhere in Europe and sending remittances back. And so, yeah, I just cite that as an example of in my work, how I've attempted to sort of bring to life, as you say, a topic that doesn't have particularly dramatic imagery or dramatic kind of dynamics in the way that the European crisis of 2015 did. But there are always going to be ways or oddities that you can focus on that allow you to tell that slightly slower story in the background of the dramatic smaller story. So that's just one idea. And then the second thing that popped into my head was that during earlier this year, there was a corona outbreak at a big abattoir, slaughterhouse in Germany. And this was a slaughterhouse staffed almost exclusively, I think, by thousands of Eastern Europeans. And for a while, it was like the only place in Germany where there was a major coronavirus outbreak, and they had to quarantine the whole factory and all the residential blocks where these workers lived in very cramped and horrible conditions. And Spiegel, the German magazine, did this like incredible 8,000-word investigation into the conditions at their factory and how they relied on migrant labor who lived in these awful conditions, conditions that became like a petri dish for the virus. And it was just an example of how you can, if you can connect like an issue that editors are really interested in, coronavirus, to an issue that they're less interested in, migrant labor and the treatment of migrant laborers in supposedly advanced Western democracy like Germany, then there is a rich avenue for people to drive down and create this 8,000 word piece of reportage. Now, obviously, you can't do that all the time, because like, how often is a story of such global interest like coronavirus going to pop up rather, and make a story like that viable? Answer, well, in Corona's case, once a century, but in a sort of general sense, 2 or 3 times a year, maybe there will be a story that connects these two things, like a big global narrative and a slightly smaller narrative that is affecting countries in the east of Europe and further east in a sort of slightly less high-profile way. But if you can seize on those moments to sort of connect those two stories when they happen, then often that's a good way of kind of bringing something that, as you say, doesn't have the necessarily the sort of fast pace and the drama of something like the European migration crisis of 2015, but you can somehow bring it into the news cycle nevertheless. Sorry, that's a long-winded way of answering. You can't access the people that you're writing about, and then just to connect it to stuff that Rob was asking about earlier. Okay, so you can't go visit, I don't know, the Ukrainian diaspora in Germany, but everyone's got smartphones. Could you like ask 6 people in Germany, France, Poland, from a particular diaspora community to like make a little film about their lives, or like take them around like where they live, or take you on a little journey to work? Could you make them into a resource? So that's like a way of reporting on this that is like not just a straight up text, but it's a collection of videos or a collection of photos by people that you've got in touch with. But B, it's like it's a way of kind of exploring just what their daily life is like for people back home who maybe don't always get the reality of what going and living in some of these tough environments is like. This is based on my own experiences, but like when you go to a refugee camp, I get the impression that actually very few refugees in those camps tell their family back home, like, actually it's pretty tough here, and we're regretting a bit coming here, and here's the toilet that we have to share with 150 other people. I don't think that actually gets broadcast back, and maybe it would be a service actually for people in that refugee community to be broadcasting that more, because it might persuade some people actually probably it's better we don't make that journey and just get stuck in those kinds of camps for 3, 4, 5 years. And maybe I don't know, that it's not a direct comparison, but maybe there is something to be done in terms of harnessing your readers or your sources and making them into kind of collaborators. If you look at like what The Guardian has built a brand on, it's like reader contributions, kind of citizen journalism, sort of gone a bit out of fashion after being really in fashion for a while. But I think it's still an interesting concept, particularly as if you, as a journalist in somewhere like Ukraine, you don't have the resources to go travel to Western Europe, but you want to show what life is like there. Well, why don't you try and harness the phones, the eyes, the ears of the people that are there, and try and see if you can make some kind of narrative out of that, be that like a webpage with 6 videos, like almost like a video diary, or I don't know, a film that edits those experiences together. Like you can make a virtue out of the fact that you're not there.